My name is Wendy Dixon. I am 32 years old, and for the last 10 years of my life, I have been the invisible architect of the Dixon family's financial stability, serving as the freelance accountant for a $4.8 million estate while being treated like an unwelcome ghost in my own childhood home. The humiliation did not come in a whisper, but rather in the booming, self-assured resonance of my father's voice during his 40th anniversary gala, held at the Grand Ballroom of the Heritage Hotel in downtown Chicago, a venue that cost exactly $14,000 for the evening, not including the vintage wine service. I stood near the edge of the mahogany buffet table, my fingers tracing the cold condensation on a glass of sparkling water, as my father, Harold Dixon, swiveled his $1,200 custom-made Italian leather armchair to face the 30 guests who represented the pinnacle of our social circle. He looked at me with a cold, dismissive indifference that had become the primary language of our relationship, and when I asked about the itinerary for the family's upcoming trip to the Amalfi Coast, he didn't even blink before delivering the blow. "You don't need to know the flight details, Wendy. Someone has to stay behind and handle the kids and the property logistics while the real family celebrates," he declared, his voice carrying over the soft jazz quartet playing in the corner. My sister Megan, who is 29 and has never held a job that lasted longer than a summer internship at our uncle's firm, let out a high-pitched, performative squeal of delight as she clutched her $2,400 Chanel caviar leather flat bag to her chest like a trophy. My mother, Eleanor, didn't look at me either, instead choosing that exact moment to adjust her Waterford crystal glasses and smooth the silk of her $6,000 Oscar de la Renta gown, her silence acting as a sharp, polished blade that cut just as deep as my father's words. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a familiar burn of shame that I had spent 3 decades trying to extinguish, while the prestigious guests, including the city's top real estate developers and surgeons, offered polite, tight-lipped smiles that were more pitying than kind. I was the eldest daughter, the one who stayed up until 3 in the morning every April 14th to ensure their tax shelters were airtight, the one who managed the payroll for the household staff, and the one who meticulously tracked the depreciation of my father's fleet of vehicles, including his precious 2024 Mercedes-Benz S-Class. Yet, in their eyes, and in the eyes of everyone they invited into their gilded world, I was merely a utility, a human ledger meant to record their successes without ever participating in them. My father's definition of the real family evidently only included those who reflected his own vanity back at him, which meant Megan, with her curated social media life and her expensive hobbies, and my mother, the loyal curator of the Dixon image. I stood there in a 3-year-old dress from a mid-tier department store, feeling the weight of the secret I had been cultivating in the chemical-scented darkness of my basement darkroom for 3 years, a secret that was worth far more than the $4.8 million I managed for them. To understand how I reached this point of utter erasure, you have to understand the environment of the Dixon household on Oakcrest Drive, a sprawling 6-bedroom estate with a monthly utility bill that averaged $1,100 just to keep the climate control perfect for my mother's collection of antique tapestries. Growing up, I was the girl who got the reliable Honda Civic for her 16th birthday, while Megan received a brand new BMW 3 Series with a red bow that cost more than my entire first year of college tuition. I didn't complain because I believed in the meritocracy of effort, thinking that if I became the most competent, the most indispensable, and the most knowledgeable person in the room, they would eventually have to see me as an equal. I earned my CPA, I built a client base of my own, and yet I still found myself sitting at the corner of their kitchen island every Sunday evening, reviewing invoices for the pool maintenance and the $400 an hour landscaping crew that kept the boxwood hedges trimmed to a precise geometric perfection. I knew the cost of everything they owned, from the $80 artisanal candles my mother burned in the foyer to the 6-figure club memberships my father used to network with men who were just as hollow as he was. But I never knew the value of my own presence in their lives because they had never assigned it a price. The anniversary dinner continued with a series of toasts that felt like a long, slow drowning as my father spoke of his legacy and the importance of passing down his values to the next generation, all while looking directly past me toward Megan and her fiancé, a man whose primary contribution to the world was having a trust fund and a respectable golf handicap. I watched as they laughed over expensive plates of Wagyu beef and truffle-infused risotto, the clinking of silver against fine china sounding like the ticking of a clock that was rapidly counting down to the moment of my departure. My father's comment about me staying behind to handle the kids was a reference to Megan's 2 young children, whom I frequently cared for without compensation, as well as the administrative nightmare of overseeing a major renovation on their vacation home in the Hamptons. They viewed my time as a free resource, something to be mined and discarded, never stopping to consider that the invisible accountant they relied on was also a woman with a passion they couldn't conceive of. For 3 years, I had been retreating to my darkroom, a small, cramped space in the basement of my modest apartment, lit only by the eerie, crimson glow of a safe light. There, amidst the smell of developer and fixer, I had been documenting a different side of the Dixon legacy, capturing the moments they thought no one was watching, the cracks in the facade that no amount of Waterford crystal could hide. As the waiter in a crisp white uniform refilled my father's glass with a vintage Cabernet that cost $300 a bottle, I realized that the man sitting in that $1,200 leather chair didn't even know who his own daughter was. He saw a tool, a reliable piece of machinery that processed numbers and kept the IRS away from his door, but he didn't see the artist who had spent thousands of hours perfecting the chemistry of film development. He didn't know that while he was busy posturing for his friends, I was building a portfolio that would eventually dismantle the very image he spent millions to maintain. The real family he spoke of was a construct of silk and leather, a fragile bubble of ego that was one sharp truth away from bursting. I stayed through the dessert course, watching as my mother daintily ate a gold-leafed chocolate torte that cost $45, her eyes never once meeting mine in a gesture of maternal solidarity. She was a woman who had traded her soul for the security of a $4.8 million estate, and she expected me to do the same, to accept my role as the silent servant of the family brand. The air in the ballroom felt heavy with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne, a suffocating mixture that made me crave the sharp, acidic tang of my darkroom chemicals. I thought about the files I had stored in my cloud drive, the digital backups of the physical prints I had made, which chronicled every financial discrepancy, every hidden debt, and every secret transaction my father had made to keep the Dixon name in the social register. I was the one who knew about the $25,000 payment to a consultant who didn't exist, and the $16,000 funneled through a shell company to cover Megan's mounting credit card debts. They thought I was just an accountant, a person who lived in the world of black and white, but I lived in the world of negatives and exposures, where the light only reveals what you choose to see. When my father turned back to his guests to tell a joke about a poor investor he had once known, his laughter was loud and jagged, the sound of a man who believed he was untouchable. I looked at my sister, who was busy taking a selfie with her Chanel bag positioned prominently in the frame, her face obscured by the digital filters she used to hide the shallowness of her existence. She was the golden child, the one who was rewarded for her beauty and her compliance, while I was the one who was punished for my competence. The contrast between us was not just a matter of personality, but a matter of fundamental architecture. She was built for the stage, and I was built for the foundation. But foundations are what hold the house up, and they are also the first thing to buckle when the earth shifts. As I stood there, ignored and dismissed, I felt the first tremors of that shift beginning within me. I wasn't just Wendy Dixon, the 32-year-old freelancer who lived in a 500-square-foot studio and drove a 10-year-old car. I was the keeper of the ledger, and the ledger was finally ready to be closed. The evening ended with my father handing out gift bags to the guests, each containing a $200 bottle of champagne and a silver-plated picture frame, a final display of wealth designed to ensure that everyone left the Heritage Hotel thinking of the Dixons as the pinnacle of success. I received no gift, no acknowledgement, and certainly no flight details for the Amalfi Coast. Instead, my father patted me on the shoulder as I was leaving, a brief, dismissive touch that felt like he was checking the sturdiness of a piece of equipment. "Make sure you get those quarterly reports to me by Monday morning, Wendy. We wouldn't want the estate to fall into disarray while we're enjoying the Mediterranean," he said, his eyes already searching for someone more important to talk to. I nodded, my voice steady despite the roar of adrenaline in my veins, and I walked out into the cool Chicago night, heading toward the parking garage where my dented car sat among the Porsches and Range Rovers of the other guests. As I drove home, the city lights blurred into long, glowing streaks that reminded me of the light leaks in a damaged camera. A beautiful, chaotic mess that signaled the end of a long, carefully controlled exposure. I was going back to my darkroom, back to the red light and the silence, where I would finally bring the Dixon family's true image into sharp, undeniable focus. Because family isn't the group of people who share your blood while treating you like a stranger. Family is the truth you are willing to stand by when everything else falls away. The status quo in the Dixon household was never a matter of simple sibling rivalry or the occasional parental oversight. Instead, it was a meticulously maintained study in cruel decimals and calculated emotional erosion that defined every waking hour of my existence. My sister Megan lived a life that was subsidized by my silence, driving a pearl-white $85,000 2024 Lexus RX 500 HF Sport Performance SUV that always occupied the primary spot in our parents' climate-controlled, heated three-car garage, a space lined with industrial-grade epoxy flooring that cost $6,000 alone. Meanwhile, my 2014 Honda Civic, with 142,000 miles on the odometer, a fading silver paint job, and a rhythmic rattle in the heat shield was relegated to the cracked asphalt of the public street 3 houses down, because my father claimed its presence in the circular driveway ruined the curb appeal of their $3.2 million colonial revival estate. This dismissal of my basic needs was the baseline of our family dynamic, an unwritten rule that dictated I was to be seen only when functional and ignored when the performance of a perfect family began for the neighbors. Every major holiday or social gathering followed a rigid, exhausting script where I arrived at the Oakcrest Drive property at precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, unlocking the back servant's entrance with a heavy heart to begin the grueling labor of preparing 12-pound organic heritage turkeys that cost $180 each from a local high-end butchery. I would spend hours in the professional-grade kitchen, my hands stained with sage and rosemary as I prepped side dishes for 30 guests, moving between the Sub-Zero refrigerator and the Wolf Range while Megan slept upstairs in her silk pajamas from La Perla that cost $400 a set. My duties extended beyond the culinary, as I was expected to polish every single piece of the family's heavy sterling silver flatware, a Reed and Barton collection that required 4 hours of meticulous rubbing with specialized chemical creams until my cuticles were raw and my back ached from leaning over the granite island. When the guests finally arrived and the laughter began to echo through the foyer, I was the one who transitioned into a silent server, replenishing crystal bowls of shrimp cocktail and ensuring the artisanal cheese boards remained pristine, only to be served last at the very end of the night, usually eating a cold, leftover portion of turkey over the sink after the real family had retired to the living room for expensive brandy. My mother would often comment on how lucky I was to be included in such a beautiful evening, completely oblivious to the fact that I had engineered every second of it, from the floral arrangements sourced for $900 to the precision-timed heating of the rolls. The financial disparity was not just a side effect of our different career paths, but a deliberate policy of the Dixon estate, where Megan's whims were treated as essential investments while my labor was calculated as a fixed cost of $0. Megan thought nothing of spending $450 on weekly manicures and pedicures at a boutique spa in the Gold Coast, where the technicians used gold-flecked polishes and served imported champagne. Yet my father viewed my professional services as an obligation of my birthright. As a licensed CPA with a thriving independent practice, I had calculated that by managing their $4.8 million portfolio, handling their complex tax filings involving offshore trusts, and providing approximately 25 hours of childcare a month for Megan's 2 toddlers, I was saving the family approximately $35,000 a year in professional fees. They never saw it as a gift or a contribution. To them, I was simply the invisible accountant, a human utility that functioned in the background like the high-efficiency HVAC system they had installed for $12,000 the previous summer. I was the wallpaper of their lives, a reliable and aesthetic-neutral presence that covered the cracks in their foundation, functional enough to be kept but unremarkable enough to be ignored. When Megan decided she wanted to take up equestrian lessons, my father didn't hesitate to wire $15,000 for a custom-fitted saddle and club membership fees. But when I mentioned that the transmission on my Honda was starting to slip and might cost $3,000 to repair, he simply looked at his Rolex Submariner and told me that a woman of my intelligence should have better managed her personal savings. The irony was suffocating, considering a significant portion of my personal savings was drained by the fact that I never charged them for the hundreds of hours I spent auditing their construction expenses for the Hamptons house, or the time I spent negotiating a 20% reduction in their property tax assessment. I watched as Megan walked through the house in her $1,200 Christian Louboutin heels, the iconic red soles clicking against the reclaimed white oak flooring, while I wore a pair of sensible $20 flats I had bought on clearance so I could stand on my feet for 12 hours without collapsing. The psychological toll of being the family's unpaid staff was a weight I carried in the set of my shoulders and the constant, low-level anxiety that lived in my chest, a feeling that no matter how much I gave, the balance sheet of their affection would always show me in the red. My sister's children, whom I loved despite the toxic environment their mother created, were often dropped off at my apartment with 20 minutes' notice because Megan had a last-minute lunch at a restaurant where the tasting menu started at $200 per person. I would cancel my own billable client meetings, losing out on my hourly rate of $175 to sit on the floor and play with wooden blocks while Megan posted photos of her sea bass and Sauvignon Blanc on social media, tagging our mother and calling it a much-needed mental health day. My mother would like every photo, commenting on how beautiful and hard-working her youngest daughter was, while I was currently scrubbing crayon marks off a wall or changing a diaper with supplies I had paid for out of my own pocket. I became a master of the micro-action, the tiny, unnoticed gestures of maintenance that kept their world spinning, replacing the batteries in the smoke detectors, ordering the specific brand of organic almond milk my father preferred, and ensuring the gardener didn't accidentally prune the rare Japanese maples too aggressively. I did it all with a quiet, practiced efficiency, becoming a ghost in the machinery of their luxury, watching through the shadows as they celebrated milestones I had helped them reach. In the dark room I had built in my basement, away from the judgmental eyes of Oakcrest Drive, I found the only place where I was the primary subject. For 3 years, I had been documenting this invisible labor, using a vintage Leica M6 camera I had purchased with a small inheritance from my paternal grandmother, the only person who had ever seen me as more than a ledger. I took high-contrast black and white photos of my raw hands after a day of polishing silver, the reflection of my tired face in the glass of their expensive wine decanters, and the stack of tax documents that represented the millions of dollars I moved for them while my own bank account remained modest. These photographs were my evidence, a visual testimony to the $35,000 in stolen labor and the countless hours of erased identity that the Dixons considered their birthright. I developed the film using precise chemical ratios, watching as the images of my own marginalization materialized in the developer tray, the gray tones capturing the soul-crushing monotony of being the family's free labor. I knew the exact cost of the chemicals, the paper, and the light, and for the first time in my life, I was willing to pay whatever price was necessary to make them see the person they had spent decades trying to disappear. The contrast between the heated garage and the cold, dark street where my car sat was the perfect metaphor for my place in the family hierarchy, a physical manifestation of the boundary they had drawn between the real Dixons and the support staff who happened to share their DNA. Even at the dinner table, the seating chart was a tactical maneuver by my mother to ensure that Megan was always positioned under the best lighting, directly across from the most influential guests, while I was placed at the corner, nearest to the kitchen door so I could easily facilitate the transition between courses. I watched the way my father's eyes lit up when Megan spoke about her trivial accomplishments, like selecting the upholstery for her new nursery, while he would interrupt me the moment I tried to discuss a new tax strategy that could save him $50,000 in capital gains. To him, my expertise was a given, a natural resource to be exploited rather than a skill to be respected. I was a study in cruel decimals because every interaction was a subtraction from my dignity and an addition to their convenience, a zero-sum game that I had been losing for 32 years. But as I stood in the kitchen that morning at 6 o'clock, the smell of raw poultry and expensive silver polish filling the air, I realized that the wallpaper was about to be stripped away, revealing the rot underneath the gilded surface of their lives. And when the truth finally emerged, no amount of $85,000 SUVs or Waterford crystal would be able to distract from the cost of what they had done to me. I was the one who controlled the books. I was the one who saw every hidden decimal, and I was finally ready to balance the scales of a family that had spent a lifetime treating me as nothing more than a footnote in their own legend. The betrayal reached its absolute suffocating peak at exactly 9:14 p.m., during the centerpiece of the evening, the official anniversary toast that was supposed to celebrate 40 years of Dixon family unity, but instead served as my public execution. I stood near the periphery of the grand ballroom, my back grazing a cold marble pillar, as the room fell into a practiced, expectant silence that felt like the air being sucked out of a vacuum. In front of 30 witnesses, an assembly of neighbors dressed in Navy Brooks Brothers blazers that cost $900 apiece, and church friends who wore their piety like designer accessories, my father stood up and tapped a sterling silver spoon against the rim of his crystal flute. The scent of the massive floral arrangements, featuring hundreds of white lilies that reeked of a funeral parlor and had been invoiced to the estate for $3,000, mixed with the sharp, yeasty aroma of the $80 a bottle Veuve Clicquot champagne that I had personally ordered and chilled to exactly 44 degrees. My father cleared his throat, his face flushed with the pride of a man who owns everything he sees, and announced to the gathered elite that as a special anniversary gift to the family, he had booked a $22,000 all-expenses-paid luxury retreat to the Four Seasons Resort Maui at Wailea for every single person standing in that room except for me. He spoke of the oceanfront suites that cost $2,400 a night and the private catamaran charters he had already secured, describing a paradise of hibiscus and salt air that was explicitly designed to exclude the person who had spent the last 72 hours ensuring this very party went off without a single hitch. The room erupted in a chorus of delighted gasps and polite applause, the sound of 30 sets of hands clapping for a trip, funded by the very tax savings I had clawed back from the IRS for them over the last fiscal year. My mother, Eleanor, drifted toward me through the crowd, her silk dress shimmering under the $3,000 Swarovski chandelier, and as she reached my side, she didn't offer an apology or even a look of regret. Instead, she leaned in close enough for me to smell the expensive French perfume on her neck and the hint of champagne on her breath, and she whispered into my ear with a chilling, practiced softness that family comes first, Wendy. And Megan has had such a stressful year with the children and the house renovations that she truly needs a break from everything. She looked at me then, her eyes behind those Waterford crystal glasses as flat and unyielding as two skipped stones, and added the final devastating blow by telling me that I was just there, a filler character in the epic narrative of their success, a person whose presence was so negligible that it didn't even register as a subtraction when they planned their escape to the tropics. I felt the weight of those words, the absolute dismissal of my humanity, And I realized that to her, I wasn't a daughter or even a person with feelings. I was a piece of inherited furniture that had been in the house so long it had become invisible. As if to punctuate my status as the household's unpaid domestic help, my brother-in-law, Derek, a senior partner at a prestigious downtown law firm who specialized in corporate litigation, caught my eye from across the buffet table. Derek was a man who earned $600 an hour, but had watched me spend 3 full weekends meticulously preparing his complex $4,000 personal tax returns for free, never once offering so much as a thank you note or a bottle of wine in exchange for my professional expertise. He stood there in his custom-tailored suit, a smirk playing on his lips that communicated a profound, mocking understanding of the hierarchy that had just been reinforced by my father's announcement. With a slow, deliberate movement that was designed to be as degrading as possible, he stepped toward me and handed me his dirty dessert plate, which was smeared with the remains of a gold-leafed chocolate torte and a crumpled, lipstick-stained linen napkin. He didn't say a word, but the way he thrust the china into my hand, expecting me to instinctively take it like a trained waitress, was the loudest statement of the night. I took the plate, the cold ceramic biting into my palm, and I watched him turn back to the group to laugh at a joke my father was making about the difficulty of finding good help these days. The humiliation was a physical weight, a pressure behind my eyes that I refused to let turn into tears because I knew that in this house vulnerability was just another resource for them to exploit. I looked down at the plate in my hand, seeing the reflection of the expensive chandelier in a smear of chocolate sauce, and I thought about the 3 years of evidence I had meticulously gathered in my darkroom, the photographic negatives that told a much darker story than the one my father was spinning for his guests. I thought about the $16,000 in hidden credit card debt I had uncovered in Megan's accounts, money she had spent on designer clothes while telling our parents she was saving for the kids' college funds, and the $25,000 consulting fee Derek had charged the family estate for legal work that I had actually performed myself. They were all complicit in the erasure of Wendy Dixon, using my labor to polish their gilded lives while treating me like a stain they couldn't quite scrub away. The 30 guests continued to chatter about flight times and packing lists for Maui, their voices rising in a crescendo of entitlement that made the air in the Heritage Hotel ballroom feel thin and toxic. I stood there, the invisible accountant, the ghost in the machinery of their $4.8 million life, and I realized that the $22,000 they were spending on their Maui trip was almost exactly the amount of money I had saved them in property tax grievances over the last 18 months alone. I had quite literally paid for their vacation with my own brilliance and silence, and in return, I was being handed garbage to carry away to the kitchen. My mother moved away from me to join Megan in a hug, the two of them looking like a portrait of generational wealth and maternal love, while I remained rooted to the spot, holding Derek's dirty dishes like a prop in a play I no longer wanted to act in. The sheer, unadulterated gall of their behavior was a catalyst, a chemical reaction that finally pushed me past the point of quiet resentment and into the realm of cold, calculated resolve. I realized then that I didn't need a ticket to Maui or a seat at their table to be powerful. I was already the person who held the keys to their treasury, and I was the only one who truly knew how deep the rot went beneath the surface of their Brooks Brothers blazers and Waterford crystal. Every smile I had faked, every hour of childcare I had provided for Megan's children without a cent of compensation, and every legal loophole I had closed for Derek felt like a brick I had been forced to carry for a decade, but now I saw them for what they really were: ammunition. My name is Wendy Dixon, and as I walked toward the service doors to dispose of the plate, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace settle over me, a feeling that only comes when you finally stop trying to earn the love of people who are incapable of giving it. I looked back one last time at the 30 guests, the real family that my father had so proudly toasted, and I saw a room full of people who were standing on a foundation of lies that I had built for them. The smell of the lilies was no longer suffocating. It was the smell of a closing chapter, the scent of a legacy that was about to be developed in the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. I had spent years in the dark room waiting for the right moment to expose the Dixon family, and as the clock moved past 9:15 p.m., I knew that the exposure time was finally over and the image was ready to be fixed. The contrast between their bright, tropical future and my dark, silent basement had never been more pronounced, yet for the first time in my life, I preferred the darkness because I was the one who controlled the light within it. I would go home tonight to my small apartment, far away from the heated garages and the $85,000 SUVs, and I would begin the process of balancing the books in a way my father never anticipated. He thought he was giving a gift to his family, but he was actually providing me with the final piece of motivation I needed to walk away and take the foundation of his empire with me. Family isn't a group of people who use your talent to fund their luxury while denying you a seat at the table. Family is the recognition of mutual worth, and since the Dixons had decided my worth was zero, I was finally free to show them what happens when that zero is removed from their balance sheet. The anniversary toast wasn't just a celebration of 40 years of marriage. It was the funeral for the daughter they thought they could keep in the shadows forever. And as I slipped out of the ballroom unnoticed, I knew that when they returned from Maui, they would find a home that was as empty as the promises they had made to me. At exactly 1:22 a.m., the silence of my 650-square-foot apartment felt like a physical weight, a stark contrast to the hollow, echoing grandeur of the Heritage Hotel ballroom I had escaped only hours before. I sat at my modest pine kitchen table, the air smelling faintly of the developer chemicals from the darkroom in the corner and the stale remains of a $5 convenience store coffee that had gone cold in my mug. Before me sat my most prized possession, a weathered Canon DSLR that I had rescued from a dusty shelf in a local pawn shop for $180 3 years ago, a tool that had become the silent witness to my secret life and the primary vessel for my rebellion. This camera, with its scratched casing and a lens that I had meticulously cleaned with a microfiber cloth until it shone like a dark jewel, held the thousands of images I had taken of the Dixon family's true architecture, the moments of cruelty, the piles of unwashed dishes I was expected to clean, and the lonely midnight hours I spent balancing their $4.8 million books. I reached out and touched the cold magnesium alloy of the camera body, feeling a surge of grounding energy, before my attention shifted to the sleek 14-inch MacBook Pro that my mother had accidentally left on the hallway console during her last visit and had forgotten to retrieve in her rush to get to her weekly $400 hair appointment. The laptop was still logged into her primary Gmail account, the screen glowing with a predatory brightness in the dimly lit room, and as I scrolled through the inbox with a trembling finger, I saw the subject line that would finally sever the last frayed threads of my loyalty. Hawaii, Wendy situation. The email thread was a chronological map of my family's clinical disregard for my existence, a digital ledger of my worthlessness in their eyes that began weeks before the anniversary party. My eyes burned, the edges of my vision blurring as I forced myself to read my mother Eleanor's words, typed out with the casual indifference of someone ordering a side of fries rather than discussing her firstborn child's life. She had written to my father and Megan that excluding me from the $22,000 Maui trip was the most efficient logistical choice because she will feel useful for once staying behind to manage the estate and the kids, adding that it is sad, but it works for us. Those 6 words, "it works for us," reverberated through my mind like a rhythmic mallet, striking at the foundation of every memory I had of trying to earn her love by being the perfect, invisible daughter. They didn't see my sacrifice as an act of devotion or my professional accounting services as a gift. They saw it as a functional convenience, a way to keep their gilded lives running smoothly without having to acknowledge the person turning the gears. The email thread continued with Megan complaining about the cost of the oceanfront suites, and my father joking that my absence would save them at least $1,500 in food and beverage costs alone over the 10-day trip. I did not cry, because tears require a belief that there is something left to save, and in that moment, I realized that the Dixon family was not a sanctuary, but a predatory ecosystem where I was the primary source of fuel. I reached for a yellow legal pad that I usually used for tracking depreciation schedules and tax loopholes, and with a black ink pen that felt heavy in my hand, I drew a single, uncompromising vertical line down the middle of the page. On the left side, I wrote the heading 32 Years of Obedience, and beneath it, I began to list the costs of my compliance. The $16,000 in Megan's debt I had hidden, the $35,000 in annual free labor I provided, the missed birthdays, the canceled vacations, and the thousands of hours I spent as a ghost in a house that didn't want me. I listed the exact model numbers of the appliances I had repaired for them, the specific amounts of the property tax grievances I had won on their behalf, and the silent humiliations of being served last at every table I had set. On the right side of the line, I wrote a single sentence that represented the secret world I had built in the shadows. A solo exhibition contract from the Weston Gallery in Carmel by the Sea. This contract, which I had received via a quiet, encrypted email 2 weeks ago, was the result of the 3 years I had spent using that $180 Canon to document the truth of wealth and the invisibility of labor. The gallery owner, a woman who valued the raw, unfiltered reality of the human condition over the polished artifice of social standing, had offered me a 3-week solo show titled The Invisible Accountant, with a guaranteed advance of $10,000 and a 60% commission on all print sales. My photographs were not just images, they were indictments, captured in high-contrast black and white, showing the raw, cracked skin of my hands against my mother's Waterford crystal and the silhouette of my tired frame against the backdrop of my father's $85,000 Lexus. The decision was cold, sharp, and final, a surgical strike that would cut the Dixons out of my life with the same clinical precision they had used to exclude me from their family. I realized that while they were planning their $22,000 escape to the Four Seasons Maui, I was planning an escape of my own that would leave them standing in the ruins of the reputation I had spent a decade protecting for them. I looked back at the email on the laptop, seeing my mother's signature at the bottom, a floral, scripted font that belied the ugliness of the message above it, and I felt a strange, chilling sense of empowerment. They thought I was a tool, a reliable piece of software that they could update or ignore at their whim, but they had forgotten that I was the one who controlled the access codes to their entire financial reality. I knew the passwords to their offshore accounts, the filing dates for their corporate audits, and the exact locations of the documents that proved my father had been inflating his net worth to secure the very loans that paid for Megan's lifestyle. As I sat in my 65-square-foot apartment, surrounded by the humble furniture I had bought with my own hard-earned money, I saw the path forward with a clarity I had never known in 32 years. I would not stay behind to handle the kids or the property logistics. I would not be the person who kept the lights on while they sipped cocktails on a beach in Hawaii. Instead, I would sign the contract for the Carmel exhibition, and the opening night would coincide exactly with the first day of their vacation, ensuring that while they were out of the country and unable to perform damage control, the world would finally see the Dixons through my lens. The contrast between the yellow legal pad and the high-tech glow of the stolen laptop was a perfect metaphor for the war I was about to wage, a battle between the analog truth of my lived experience and the digital lies of their curated existence. I began to write a list of the things I would need to pack: my cameras, my negatives, the backup hard drives containing the forensic accounting of their estate, and the single silver-plated frame my father had given as a party favor, which I would use to display the email I had just read. I calculated the cost of the flight to California, the rental of a small studio near the coast, and the price of the freedom I was finally claiming for myself. The total was a fraction of the Dixon estate's value, yet it was worth more than the $4.8 million I had spent my life managing, because it was a number that belonged entirely to me. I thought about Derek and the smirk he had given me when he handed me his dirty plate, and I realized that by the time he returned from Maui, he would be facing a legal and financial audit that no amount of Brooks Brothers blazers could protect him from. I was the one who had done his taxes for free, but now I would be the one who ensured he paid the full price for his arrogance. The air in my apartment began to feel lighter, the suffocating pressure of Oakcrest Drive finally dissipating as I made my final notes on the legal pad, my handwriting becoming bolder and more certain with every word. I looked at the digital clock on my microwave, which now read 2:44 a.m., and I realized that for the first time in my life, I was operating on my own schedule, driven by my own ambitions rather than the whims of a family that saw me as a servant. My name is Wendy Dixon, and while I may have been the invisible accountant for 10 years, I was about to become the most visible person in their lives, a focal point of truth that would expose the hollow core of the Dixon legacy. I closed my mother's laptop with a satisfying, muffled click, the screen going dark and ending the transmission of their cruelty, and I picked up my Canon DSLR, feeling the weight of the future in my hands. The line I had drawn down the middle of the yellow paper was more than just a division of facts. It was a border crossing, a point of no return where the daughter they thought they could use finally died, and the artist who would expose them was born. I would leave the keys to their estate on the kitchen counter of their empty house, but the locks on my heart and my future had already been changed, and no amount of money in their $4.8 million portfolio would ever be enough to buy my silence again. Family isn't a debt you pay in perpetuity to people who view your labor as a convenience. Family is a contract of mutual respect, and since the Dixons had breached that contract 1,000 times over, I was finally ready to file for an emotional and professional divorce that would be documented in every gallery from Carmel to New York. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in quiet, surgical precision as I moved through my apartment and the Dixon estate one last time to gather the components of what I now thought of as my arsenal. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontations, and no wasted energy on the people who had already checked out of my life mentally to prepare for their $22,000 Hawaiian getaway. Instead, there was only the cold, methodical rhythm of a woman reclaiming her stolen labor and her suppressed identity. My first call was placed at 6:15 a.m. to my Aunt Ruth in Carmel by the Sea, California, the woman my father had spent 2 decades branding as the family disappointment simply because she had walked away from the Dixon inheritance to open a small, artisanal cafe and photography studio that was now a thriving $1.2 million cornerstone of her coastal community. Ruth picked up on the second ring, her voice smelling of sea salt and dark roast coffee even through the digital haze of the cellular connection, and when I told her I was finally ready to accept the guest cottage she had offered me 3 years ago, her laughter was the first genuine sound of joy I had heard in months. She didn't ask for explanations because she had been the first person to see the invisible daughter for who she actually was, and she understood better than anyone that leaving the Dixon orbit required a celestial kind of velocity that only the truth could provide. With Ruth's encouragement acting as the wind at my back, I turned my attention to the physical manifestation of my secret life, carefully packing my 15-piece portfolio titled Invisible Women, a collection of high-contrast, large-format photographs that captured the intersection of domestic labor and high society neglect. These images were not merely pictures but were heavy, tactile indictments printed on 80-pound archival cotton rag paper, each one representing a moment where I had been present but uncounted, a ghost in a house of glass. Marcus Coleman, the esteemed owner of the Weston Gallery who had discovered my work through an anonymous online submission, had called the collection extraordinary during our final Zoom consultation, noting that my ability to find the profound tragedy in the reflection of a silver serving platter or the fraying hem of a waitress's apron was unlike anything he had seen in the contemporary Chicago art scene. I handled each print with white cotton gloves, sliding them into acid-free sleeves and then into a professional-grade flight case that cost $480. A price I paid gladly because these pieces of paper were the only equity I truly owned after 10 years of service to a $4.8 million estate. My armory did not consist of weapons or threats, but of documentation and the undeniable weight of a signed contract for a solo exhibition that carried a 60% commission rate on all sales, a figure that signaled Marcus's absolute belief in my commercial and artistic viability. While my father believed I was spent, and my mother believed I was useful only as a placeholder, this contract proved that in the real world, the one outside the suffocating gates of Oakcrest Drive, my vision had a market value that far exceeded the $35,000 in annual labor I had been donating to my family. I spent hours at my desk with a high-speed scanner, digitizing every single unpaid invoice for the accounting services, childcare, and property management I had performed over the last decade, creating a forensic folder that detailed exactly how much the Dixon lifestyle had been subsidized by my exploitation. I gathered the master keys to their digital lives, the encrypted flash drives containing the passwords to the offshore tax shelters and the corporate payroll accounts I had built from scratch, and I felt the immense, terrifying power of the person who knows where all the bodies are buried because she was the one who dug the graves and filed the death certificates. The technical detail of my departure was a study in hyper-realism, from the specific weight of the archival paper in my hands to the precise sound of the deadbolt clicking shut on my apartment door for the last time. I was not just moving my body, I was moving an entire history of observation, shifting the focus from the Dixon family's curated perfection to the raw, unedited reality of the woman who had made that perfection possible. I looked at the folder of invoices, seeing the numbers I had typed out in 12-point Helvetica, the $400 for an emergency audit on a Sunday morning, the $1,500 for a week of 24-hour childcare while Megan was in Aspen, the $3,000 for negotiating a vendor contract that saved my father $20,000 on his kitchen renovation. These were not just debts, they were the receipts of my erasure. And as I tucked them into my leather messenger bag alongside my Canon DSLR, I felt the finality of my decision settling into my bones like a cold front. I was no longer the accountant who balanced their books to zero. I was the artist who was going to show the world that the Dixon balance sheet was written in the blood and sweat of the daughter they had discarded. I spent the final evening before my flight sitting on the floor of my empty living room, the 65-square-foot space now echoing with the absence of my belongings, which were already being picked up by a professional moving service I had hired for $2,800. I thought about my father's $1,200 leather chair and my mother's Waterford crystal, and I realized that those objects were just heavy, expensive anchors designed to keep them moored to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. My wealth was portable, contained within the magnesium alloy of my camera and the ink on my exhibition contract, and it was a wealth that didn't require the permission of Harold or Eleanor Dixon to exist. I reached out to Marcus Coleman one last time to confirm the delivery of the promotional materials, and he informed me that the opening night invitations had already been sent to the top 500 collectors on the West Coast, describing me as a formidable new voice in social documentary photography. The irony was not lost on me that while my family was preparing to be anonymous tourists in Maui, I was preparing to be the most talked-about name in one of the most prestigious art colonies in the world. As I checked my digital clock for the final time in that apartment, seeing the numbers 3:33 a.m. glow in the dark, I felt a sense of alignment that was almost spiritual, a realization that my life was no longer a series of cruel decimals but a singular, focused exposure. I had the tax records that could dismantle my father's corporate standing, the keys that could lock Megan out of her subsidized luxury, and the photographs that would strip my mother of her social armor. But I also had something far more valuable, the ability to walk away and never look back. My Aunt Ruth had told me that the greatest revenge was not the destruction of your enemies, but the absolute irrelevance of their opinion. And as I zipped my flight case shut, I knew I had reached that summit. The Dixons would return from their $22,000 vacation to find a vacuum where their daughter used to be, a silence that no amount of money could fill, and a public record of their private failures hanging on the white walls of a gallery 3,000 miles away. I left the keys to my apartment in the drop box for the landlord and walked out to the curb where a black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe was waiting to take me to O'Hare International Airport, a car service I had booked for a flat rate of $150 to ensure I arrived with the dignity of a woman who was finally in control of her own transit. The driver was silent and professional, the interior of the SUV smelling of leather and expensive cleaning agents, and as we pulled away from the curb and headed toward the expressway, I watched the skyline of Chicago recede in the rearview mirror like a fading exposure. I was heading toward a world of salt air, 80-pound archival paper, and 60% commissions, leaving behind the study of cruel decimals for a life of infinite possibilities. My name is Wendy Dixon, and while the invisible daughter had spent 32 years in the shadows, the woman who was arriving in Carmel was going to be impossible to ignore because her arsenal was not made of lead and steel, but of light, truth, and the courage to finally charge the full price for her presence. Family is not the people who treat your existence as a convenience. Family is the recognition of your light. And as the sun began to rise over the lake, I realized I was finally heading home to the only person who had ever truly seen me: myself. The final confrontation took place exactly 48 hours before their scheduled departure for Maui, a Tuesday morning where the air inside the Dixon Colonial Estate on Oakcrest Drive was thick with the frenetic, self-absorbed energy of people who have never had to pack their own suitcases without complaining about the effort. I walked into the foyer at precisely 10:15 a.m., the heavy mahogany door swinging open with a familiar groan that usually signaled the beginning of my shift as the family's unpaid logistical coordinator. The grand entrance, which featured a $12,000 curved staircase and a Persian rug that cost more than my first 3 years of rent, was currently a chaotic staging ground for their luxury. They were surrounded by a mountain of expensive gear, including a 6-piece set of midnight black Tumi hardside luggage that reeked of $3,000 in brand-name status, and several North Face base camp duffels in various sizes meant for their private excursions. My mother, Eleanor, was pacing the length of the marble floor, her voice sharp and percussive as she barked out a list of emergency orders regarding my nephew Oliver's specific strawberry allergy and the precise temperature at which the guest house pool needed to be maintained while they were away. She didn't look at me when I entered. She simply pointed toward a stack of cardboard boxes near the pantry and told me that the grocery delivery would be arriving in 20 minutes and that I needed to ensure the organic kale was washed and stored in airtight containers before the kids woke up from their naps. I stood in the center of the doorway, framed by the white crown molding that I had personally touched up with a $4 brush last spring, but I wasn't wearing my usual kitchen-ready leggings or the oversized sweaters I used to hide my identity. Instead, I wore a $300 charcoal gray tailored blazer, a piece I had purchased with the first half of my gallery advance, which felt like a suit of high-tensile armor against the toxic atmosphere of my childhood home. I didn't reach for a suitcase, and I didn't pick up the discarded packing tape that Megan had dropped on the floor. Instead, I held a single, heavy manila envelope that contained the physical end of the Dixon era. My voice, when I finally spoke, was as steady and rhythmic as a hospital heart monitor, devoid of the shaking plea for validation that had characterized my tone for 32 years. "I'm not watching the kids," I said, the words cutting through my mother's frantic monologue like a clinical incision. The silence that followed was instantaneous and vacuum-sealed, the kind of quiet that only happens when a servant suddenly stops serving and starts existing. My father, Harold, looked up from his iPad where he was checking the weather for the Wailea coast, his face reddening with the slow, simmering fuse of a man whose convenience has been threatened. "I am moving to California," I continued, my eyes locked onto my mother's Waterford crystal glasses, which seemed to tremble slightly as she finally processed my presence. "My flight leaves in exactly 6 hours from O'Hare, and my belongings are already in a shipping container halfway across the country." The manila envelope I was holding contained more than just my resignation. It held the summary of the 10,000 hours of labor they had stolen from me, and the signed contract from the Weston Gallery that proved I was worth more than the 0 they had assigned to my life. My sister Megan came down the stairs then, clutching a $900 silk robe around her waist, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and genuine offense that I would dare to disrupt the schedule of her vacation. "Who is going to drive us to the airport, Wendy?" she asked, her voice reaching that familiar, high-pitched frequency of entitlement that usually forced me into compliance. "You can't just leave. Dad already booked the catamaran, and we need you to handle the insurance claim for the leak in the basement while we're gone." I looked at her, seeing the $2,400 Chanel bag sitting on the bottom step, and I felt a wave of profound, crystalline clarity that I had never experienced before. The hyper-realism of the moment was staggering. The smell of expensive leather luggage, the glint of the sunlight on the $85,000 Lexus parked just outside the window, and the raw, ugly shock on my parents' faces as they realized the wallpaper was peeling itself off the walls. My mother tried to laugh, a brittle social climber's laugh that didn't reach her eyes, and she told me that I was being dramatic because of the Maui trip, promising that they would bring me back something beautiful from the hotel boutique if I just stayed and kept things running. It was the ultimate insult, the idea that my decade of professional service and emotional erasure could be compensated with a $200 silk scarf and a pat on the head. I stepped forward and placed the manila envelope on the Toomey suitcase that sat between us, the sound of the paper hitting the nylon echoing in the cavernous foyer. In that envelope, you will find the final invoices for every hour of accounting work, childcare, and property management I have provided since I turned 22, I told them. My voice remains cool and professional. The total comes to $354,000 in unpaid professional fees, and while I know you'll never pay it, I wanted you to see the exact price of the daughter you chose to ignore. My father stood up then, his $1,200 leather chair creaking behind him in the study, and he began to bluster about loyalty and the cost of the roof over my head when I was a child. But I didn't wait for him to finish the script. I had spent 3 decades listening to his rehearsals of grandeur, and I was finished being the audience. "I am also leaving you the keys to the digital vault," I said, though I've changed the administrative passwords to reflect the new reality of our relationship. "If you want to access the offshore accounts or the tax filings for the Hamptons property, you'll have to hire a forensic accountant at $350 an hour because the free labor ends at 10:21 a.m. today." I saw the moment the financial implications hit him, the realization that the invisible girl was the only one who knew how to navigate the labyrinth of his $4.8 million estate. Without me, they weren't just losing a daughter. They were losing the architect of their security, the person who made the decimals behave so they could live in a world of rounded numbers and easy luxury. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the friction of a lifelong power dynamic being inverted in the span of a few minutes. I looked at the North Face gear and the Toomey luggage, objects that symbolized their mobility and my stagnation, and I realized that I was the one who was truly going on a journey. My flight to California wasn't just a change in zip code, it was a transition from a negative exposure to a full-color reality. I saw my mother reach for her phone, probably to call Aunt Ruth or one of her socialite friends to complain about my betrayal, and I smiled because I knew that Ruth was currently at the airport in San Jose, waiting to pick me up in her vintage truck that smelled of salt and success. They were stuck in a colonial house filled with expensive things and empty rooms, while I was heading toward a studio where the only thing that mattered was the truth I could capture with my $180 Canon. I felt the weight of the charcoal blazer on my shoulders, a physical reminder of the person I had become in the darkness of my basement darkroom, and I turned toward the door without waiting for a goodbye. The finality of the moment was a sharp, clean break, like the snap of a high-end camera shutter. As I walked out onto the porch, the morning sun hitting the silver paint of my 2014 Honda Civic, which was still parked on the street, I heard my father shout something about me being ungrateful, but the sound was muffled by the closing of the heavy mahogany door. I got into my car, the engine rattling with its familiar 142,000-mile protest, and I didn't look back at the $3.2 million estate that had been my prison and my workplace. I had 6 hours to get to the airport, to return the keys to my apartment, and to leave the study of cruel decimals behind forever. My name is Wendy Dixon. I am 32 years old, and as I pulled away from the curb, leaving the Dixon legacy to crumble under the weight of its own entitlement, I realized that I wasn't just moving to California. I was moving into my own life. The $22,000 trip to Maui would go on, but they would find that the paradise they sought was a lot less comfortable without the person who had been carrying their bags in secret for 10 years. I checked my digital clock as I merged onto the expressway, the numbers 10:45 a.m. glowing with a new kind of significance. I was exactly 5 hours and 15 minutes away from being free, from standing in a gallery in Carmel where my name would be on the wall not as a footnote, but as the main event. The invisible daughter was gone, replaced by a woman who knew the exact value of her time, her talent, and her soul. I thought about the 30 guests at the anniversary party, the Brooks Brothers blazers, and the Waterford crystal, and I felt a sense of pity for them, trapped in a cycle of performance while I was finally stepping into the light. Family isn't the people who share your DNA while expecting you to disappear for their convenience. Family is the people who see your armor and know exactly what it took to forge it. As the skyline of Chicago began to shrink in my rearview mirror, I turned up the radio, the sound of the engine and the music blending into a symphony of departure, and for the first time in 32 years, I wasn't accounting for anyone else's happiness, but my own. The Dixon estate was a closed book, a settled account, and as I headed toward the terminal, I knew that the best photographs were the ones I was about to take, in a world where I was no longer the one holding the dirty plates, but the one telling the story. The confrontation in the foyer of the Dixon estate transitioned from a domestic dispute into a cold public execution of the family's collective ego, a barrage of undeniable facts that stripped away the veneer of their $4.8 million life with the efficiency of a high-speed shutter. When my sister Megan began to scream that I was being selfish and ungrateful, her voice echoing off the $12,000 curved staircase and clashing with the quiet prestige of the neighborhood, I didn't flinch or retreat into my usual silence. Instead, I reached into my leather messenger bag and handed her a high-resolution printout of the email thread I had discovered on our mother's laptop. I stood my ground on the polished marble floor, my $300 charcoal blazer providing a physical barrier against her entitlement. And I read the most damning line aloud, my voice projected with the clarity of a professional auditor presenting a closing statement. "She'll feel useful for once," I recited, the words hanging in the air like a heavy mist, followed by the clinical observation that my exclusion worked for them because it maintained the status quo of my invisible labor. My father, Harold, attempted to make a strategic retreat toward the safety of his $1,200 leather armchair in the study, his face a mottled shade of crimson that matched the expensive Persian rug beneath his feet. But I blocked his path with the sheer weight of the evidence I was about to drop on the kitchen's granite countertop. I have saved this family exactly $112,320 in professional accounting and administrative services over the last 5 years alone, I stated, dropping the itemized list I had meticulously prepared onto the cold stone surface with a satisfying, heavy thud. The document was a forensic breakdown of every quarterly tax filing, every property tax grievance I had successfully argued, and every hour of childcare I had provided for Megan's 2 children, all calculated at a conservative market rate of $175 per hour. I watched as my mother, Eleanor, adjusted her Waterford crystal glasses, her eyes darting across the figures as if looking for a decimal point she could argue with. But there were no errors in my ledger. I then pulled out the centerpiece of my arsenal, the signed contract from the Weston Gallery in Carmel by the Sea for my solo exhibition, titled Invisible Women, Portraits of the Overlooked. I showed them the promotional postcard that featured a stark, black-and-white photograph of my own hands polishing their silver, an image that Marcus Coleman had described as a haunting indictment of generational neglect. The silence that followed was so thick and suffocating that you could actually hear the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of the $4,000 mahogany grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that seemed to count down the final seconds of my tenure as the Dixon family's ghost. I looked my father directly in the eye, ignoring the Toomey luggage and the North Face gear that stood ready for a vacation I was no longer facilitating, and I delivered the final, non-negotiable terms of my departure. If I am not family enough to be included in a $22,000 trip to Maui, then I am certainly not staff enough to spend another minute managing the chaos in your basement or the complexities of your tax shelters, I told him, my tone as sharp and final as a guillotine blade. I watched the realization sink in that they weren't just losing a daughter they didn't value, they were losing the person who kept the IRS at bay and the household running with the precision of a Swiss watch. My mother, sensing the total collapse of her carefully curated domestic narrative, began to launch into a rehearsed, melodramatic sob, her hands fluttering toward her face in a gesture of practiced grief that no one in the room, including the two toddlers playing with wooden blocks in the corner, believed anymore. It was a performance that had worked on me for 3 decades, a manipulative display of maternal fragility designed to guilt me back into my role as the invisible support beam. But the charcoal blazer I wore was made of a material her tears couldn't penetrate. The hyper-realism of the scene was punctuated by the contrast between the high-end luxury surrounding them and the hollow, desperate energy of their reactions. Megan was clutching her $2,400 Chanel bag as if it could protect her from the reality that she would now have to pay for her own childcare. And my father was staring at the itemized list of $112,000 as if it were a death warrant for his lifestyle. I realized in that moment that their wealth was a fragile construction of credit and stolen labor, a house of cards that I had been holding together with my silence and my expertise. By presenting them with the market value of my existence, I had effectively turned the Dixon estate into a bankrupt entity, at least in terms of the emotional and professional capital they had been drawing from me for free. I didn't wait for them to process the numbers or offer a last-minute hollow apology that would have been driven by fear rather than love. I simply turned toward the mahogany door, the manila envelope empty, and my messenger bag heavy with the tools of my new life. As I walked out of the house, the sound of the grandfather clock was replaced by the low, distant hum of the 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe idling at the curb, the driver waiting to take me to the airport where a one-way ticket to California represented the first investment I had ever made in myself. I felt the cool morning air hit my face, a sharp contrast to the stagnant, expensive scent of lilies and silver polish that defined the interior of Oakcrest Drive. My 2014 Honda Civic sat like a sentinel on the street, a reminder of the 10 years I had spent being relegated to the curb. But I didn't feel a sting of resentment anymore. I only felt the immense, terrifying freedom of a person who has finally balanced her own books. My name is Wendy Dixon, and as I stepped into the SUV, leaving behind the $3.2 million Colonial and the 32 years of obedience, I knew that the invisible woman was about to become a permanent fixture in the world of light and shadow. The Dixons would fly to Maui in 48 hours, sitting in their oceanfront suites and sipping their expensive cocktails, but they would find that the silence I left behind was a much louder indictment than any shout could ever be. The moral of my story is that family isn't found in the shared names on a deed or the genetics reflected in a Waterford glass. Family is the people who respect the boundaries of your labor and the value of your soul. I had spent 10 years trying to be enough for people who viewed me as a utility, and it took a single email thread and a 60% commission contract to realize that I was already more than they could ever afford. I looked back one last time at the house, seeing the silhouette of my father through the study window still staring at the list of $112,000, and I realized that he was finally doing the one thing he had always avoided. He was looking at the truth of what I had given him. I was heading to a gallery where my work would be sold to strangers who would appreciate the texture of my struggle, while the people who shared my blood were left to navigate a world where the free help had finally checked out. The Invisible Women exhibition wasn't just a collection of photographs, it was my declaration of independence, and as the driver pulled away from the curb, I realized that the most important portrait I would ever create was the one of the woman currently sitting in the back seat, heading toward a horizon that was no longer defined by the cruel decimals of the Dixon family estate. The aftermath of my departure from Oakcrest Drive was not just a change of scenery, but a profound and absolute state of pure, unadulterated catharsis that washed over me like the cold, cleansing waves of the Pacific Ocean. While my family was entrenched in their $22,000 luxury retreat at the Four Seasons Maui at Wailea, the reality of my absence began to dismantle their carefully curated paradise within the first 48 hours of their arrival. I later learned through a series of increasingly desperate and eventually ignored voicemails that their trip had devolved into a logistical and emotional disaster, characterized by painful ear infections for the toddlers that required a $300 an hour private pediatrician and middle-of-the-night tantrums that Megan was utterly unequipped to handle without her free help. There was no one to coordinate the private catamaran charters I had spent weeks vetting, no one to manage the insurance adjusters back in Illinois for the basement leak that had worsened during a sudden Midwest thunderstorm, and certainly no one to act as the emotional buffer between my father's fragile ego and my mother's mounting frustration. They were trapped in a gilded cage of their own making, surrounded by hibiscus flowers and salt air that they were too miserable to enjoy, finally forced to confront the true cost of the daughter they had spent 32 years trying to erase. I, meanwhile, was breathing 100% pure salt air in Carmel by the Sea, California, living in my Aunt Ruth's guest cottage which sat on a jagged cliff overlooking the turquoise waters of the Monterey Bay. The contrast between my old life of cruel decimals and my new existence of artistic clarity was staggering. Instead of staring at spreadsheets and tax shelters, I spent my mornings watching the fog roll over the cypress trees and my afternoons in the darkroom, perfecting the prints for the most important night of my life. My opening night at the Weston Gallery was a transcendent experience that redefined my understanding of my own value, as the Invisible Women exhibition drew a crowd of serious collectors, critics, and enthusiasts who saw the profound beauty in the very labor my family had deemed worthless. Within the first 2 hours of the doors opening, I had brought in $14,200 in sales, with several of my large-format black-and-white portraits of domestic invisibility being acquired by a private museum foundation for their permanent collection. As I stood in the gallery wearing my $300 charcoal blazer, sipping a glass of local Pinot Noir, and discussing my photographic technique with people who truly saw me, I realized that the invisible accountant had finally stepped into a light so bright that it could never be dimmed by the shadows of Oakcrest Drive again. The financial independence I secured that night was more than just a number on a balance sheet. It was the definitive proof that my worth was not a variable to be manipulated by Harold and Eleanor Dixon, but a constant that I had finally learned to measure for myself. I waited until the morning after the exhibition, when the sun was high over the Santa Lucia Mountains, to perform the final act of my professional and personal divorce. I sat at my laptop on Ruth's redwood deck and systematically blocked every one of their phone numbers, ending the cycle of frantic, entitled text messages and late-night calls demanding that I fix their mistakes from 3,000 miles away. Before I closed my personal email account for good, I sent one final clinical message to my father and Derek, attached to which was a formal schedule of my new professional hourly rates, $350 for accounting services and $500 for forensic auditing, should they ever find themselves in a position where they realized they actually needed a professional instead of a servant. I hit send with a steady hand, feeling the final tether to their $4.8 million estate snap with a quiet, satisfying click. And I knew that I would never again be the person who stayed behind to handle the kids while the real family celebrated. The hyper-realism of my new life in Carmel was a world away from the $900 Toomey luggage and the $4,000 grandfather clocks that had measured the slow death of my spirit in Illinois. Here, the values were different. Wealth was measured in the quality of light at dusk, the texture of 80-pound archival paper, and the sincerity of a conversation held over a simple meal at Ruth's Cafe. I watched the $1.2 million business my aunt had built with her own two hands and realized that her disappointment was actually the greatest success story in the family, a beacon of autonomy that I had finally followed to safety. My name is Wendy Dixon. I am 32 years old, and I am no longer just there, a piece of human furniture meant to hold up the heavy weight of other people's expectations. I am a woman who has reclaimed her time, her talent, and her identity from the ruins of a toxic legacy, and for the first time in my life, when I look in the mirror or into the lens of my $180 Canon, I am finally, undeniably visible. The moral of this journey is that the points of no return are often marked not by loud explosions, but by the quiet, cold realization that you are the only one who can truly balance the books of your own soul. I had spent a decade believing that if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, and made myself small enough, I would eventually earn a seat at the table. But the truth is that the table was never meant for me because it was built on my back. By walking away, I didn't just find a new career or a new home. I found the courage to stop being an asset in someone else's portfolio and start being the primary shareholder in my own life. Family is not a contract of perpetual debt that you pay with your dignity. It is a bond of mutual recognition, and if the people who share your blood cannot see the light you carry, it is your responsibility to take that light somewhere it can truly shine. As I walk along the white sands of Carmel Beach, the 60% commission from my show providing a safety net I built myself, I look at the horizon and see no limits, only the beautiful, unedited exposure of a future that belongs entirely to me. The Dixon family returned from Maui to a house that felt colder and emptier than they could have ever imagined, forced to navigate the complexities of their own lives without the invisible foundation they had taken for granted. They would eventually have to hire the expensive accountants and the professional property managers I had suggested, and with every bill they paid, they would be reminded of the daughter they had traded for a $22,000 vacation. But their struggles are no longer my concern, nor are their opinions a weight I am required to carry. I am busy documenting the lives of other people who have been overlooked, using my art to give a voice to the silent and a face to the invisible, turning my pain into a professional legacy that actually matters. I am Wendy Dixon, and as I sit in the golden hour of a California afternoon, listening to the rhythmic crash of the surf against the rocks, I know that I have finally reached the only destination that ever mattered, a life where my presence is a choice, my labor is a gift, and my visibility is an absolute, non-negotiable truth.